They didn't ask her to kneel. They made her, foot nudging the back of her leg like she was something less than human, laughing as she collapsed onto the polished floor of the velvet crown. Glass exploded under her knees, whiskey spreading like spilled blood across dark wood. The lounge went silent. Even the ambient music seemed to choke on its own notes, because across the room, past the frozen patrons and raised phones, the entrance door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped inside, unhurried, deliberate, eyes already calculating exactly how much pain this lesson would cost. And the 3 men in black vests? They had maybe 10 seconds left before they understood they hadn't humiliated just another waitress. They'd forced the sister of Felix Montero to her knees. So what happens first? The recognition? The fear? Or the realization that some mistakes you don't walk away from? If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. Susan's hands found the floor first, palms pressing into liquid and shards. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, but she didn't cry out. Couldn't. Years of survival had taught her that sound only fed cruelty, that tears were invitations for more. She knelt there, professional uniform now ruined, dark curls falling across her face like a curtain she wished would hide her completely. Amber light from the bar reflected off the spreading pool of liquor, turning the floor into a mirror that showed her exactly what she'd become. Small, powerless, alone. The 3 men stood over her in matching black vests and expensive shoes, forming a semicircle of entitlement. The one who'd pushed her tall, with rolled sleeves and a tattoo creeping up his forearm, crossed his arms and smiled like he'd won something. "Maybe hospitality isn't your calling," he said, voice loud enough to carry, loud enough to perform. His friends laughed. One pulled out his phone, angling it downward. The red recording light felt like a brand against Susan's skin. Around them, the velvet crown held its breath. 60 patrons sat frozen in their leather booths and high-backed chairs, business suits worth more than Susan's monthly rent, evening dresses that cost what she made in tips over 3 shifts, watches that could pay off her student loans. All of them watching, none of them moving. Fear is contagious like that. It spreads through silence, through averted eyes, through the careful study of wine glasses, and suddenly fascinating dinner plates. A woman in pearls whispered something to her companion. A man in a gray suit shifted in his seat, almost standing, then thought better of it. The bartender Miguel, who trained Susan on her first day, gripped the edge of the bar but stayed rooted behind it. The velvet crown demanded a certain type of discretion. Intervention was messy. Witnesses were safer. Susan pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the sob building in her chest. The tears came anyway, hot and shameful, spilling down her cheeks despite every effort to stop them. She hated herself for crying, hated them for making her, hated the room for watching it happen. "Look at that," the second man said, pointing. "She's crying now." "Should have been more careful," added the third, examining his nails. "Actions have consequences." The first man, the one who'd pushed her, tilted his head like he was considering something profound. "You know what? I don't think she's learned her lesson yet." He nudged a larger piece of broken glass toward her with the toe of his polished shoe. "Clean it up properly this time." Susan's fingers trembled as she reached for the glass. Sharp edges bit into her skin, but she barely felt it. Physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders, the eyes burning into her back, the laughter that seemed to echo off the expensive wallpaper. She was so focused on the floor, on surviving the next 60 seconds, that she didn't notice the change in the room's atmosphere. But everyone else did. The temperature seemed to drop. The air grew heavy, thick with something unnamed. The ambient jazz, soft saxophones, and gentle piano cut off mid-phrase, as if the sound system itself had sensed the shift. Conversations died. Glasses stopped moving. Even breathing seemed to pause. Miguel, the bartender, went absolutely still, his knuckles white against the bar. The woman in pearls set down her wine with a hand that shook slightly. The man in the gray suit, who'd almost stood before, now pressed himself back into his booth like he was trying to become invisible. The entrance door had opened. Felix Montero stepped inside. He moved with the kind of calm that made your stomach drop, the kind of stillness that promised violence without needing to demonstrate it. Dark coat hanging open over a pressed shirt, hands relaxed at his sides, face carved from the kind of discipline that comes from knowing exactly how much damage you're capable of and choosing for now not to deliver it. He was handsome in the way dangerous things often are. Sharp jawline, dark eyes that missed nothing, hair styled with the kind of care that suggested control extended to every detail. But it was his presence that commanded the room, that quiet, inevitable authority that bent the air around him. 20 feet away, Susan knelt on broken glass, unaware her entire world was about to shift. Felix's eyes found her immediately. His sister, his blood, his responsibility. He saw the tears, the trembling hands, the three men standing over her like predators who'd cornered prey. His expression didn't change. That was somehow worse than anger. Rage was hot, unpredictable, messy. What moved across Felix Montero's face was cold mathematics, the precise calculation of how much consequence these men had earned. He took one step forward, then another. Footsteps silent on the polished floor, coat moving with each deliberate stride. The patrons recognized him. Some had seen him before, others knew him only by reputation. All of them understood what his presence meant. Money could buy you into the Velvet Crown, but power, real power, was something you either had or you didn't, and Felix Montero had built his name on a foundation of promises kept and lessons delivered. One of the bartenders dropped a glass. The sound shattered the silence. The three men in black vests continued laughing, oblivious, too focused on their entertainment to notice the room's transformation. Too drunk on their own perceived dominance to sense the predator approaching from behind. Felix crossed half the distance. Then 3/4. Susan finally looked up, tears still wet on her cheeks, and saw him. Their eyes met. She didn't call out. Didn't need to. Felix stopped 5 feet behind the men, close enough to hear their laughter, close enough to see exactly how they'd positioned themselves around his sister. He waited, patient, letting the moment build, letting witnesses remember, because what came next would matter. 3 months earlier, Susan had walked into the Velvet Crown believing opportunity wore polished brass fixtures and leather upholstery. She'd been wrong about that. Dead wrong. Rule number 1, the floor manager had said during her first shift, barely looking up from his clipboard. The customer is always right, even when they're wrong. Rule number 2, don't talk back, ever. Rule number 3, if something breaks, you pay for it. He'd smiled then, thin and administrative. Questions? Susan had swallowed every single one of them. The Velvet Crown occupied the kind of real estate that announced wealth before you even walked through the doors. Marble steps, brass railings that gleamed under amber light, windows tinted just enough to suggest secrets lived inside. The clientele matched the decor. Executives who closed deals over aged whiskey, socialites who treated servers like furniture, men in expensive suits who measured their importance by how invisible they could make the people serving them. Susan had needed the job. That was the beginning and end of her negotiating power. The first week, she'd learned to walk without making sound. The second week, she'd mastered the art of being present but unseen, refilling glasses before they emptied, clearing plates before being asked, anticipating needs while remaining perpetually out of frame. By the third week, she'd understood the real rules, the ones nobody wrote down. Don't make eye contact for too long. Don't smile too widely. Don't exist too loudly. And absolutely, under no circumstances, embarrass a customer, especially not the regulars who came in every Friday wearing black vests and entitlement like cologne. Those 3 had noticed her immediately, though not in any way that felt like being seen, more like being assessed, catalogued, filed away under exploitable. The tall one with the forearm tattoo, Susan had learned his name was Derek. Though he'd never bothered learning hers, enjoyed making her reach across him for empty glasses, positioning himself so she'd have to brush against his shoulder. "Excuse me," she'd murmur. He'd lean in closer. The second one, stockier with a ring on every finger, liked to change his order 3 times, watching her write it down, cross it out, rewrite it, then claim she'd gotten it wrong anyway. "Is it really that difficult?" he'd ask, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The third one, lean and cruel, smiled. Preferred psychological games. He'd leave generous tips, then ask for them back. "Actually, I don't think you earned this, do you?" What could she say? The answer was predetermined. Susan had endured it all because endurance was survival, because rent was due on the 1st of every month and student loans didn't care about dignity, because jobs like this, in places like this, didn't come easily to women with community college degrees and resumes full of gaps. So she'd smiled through gritted teeth, said yes sir, and right away, and my apologies. Built walls inside herself where pride could hide from humiliation, where self-respect could wait out the shift. But tonight, something had broken. Not just the glasses, though, those had shattered spectacularly, whiskey and gin mixing with crystal shards across the polished floor. What broke was the invisible line between exploitation and exhibition, between endurance and entertainment. Derek had called her over with a snap of his fingers. Actual fingers snapping, like she was a dog. She'd come anyway. That was the job. "This drink is warm," he'd said, though he'd barely touched it. "I'll get you a fresh one immediately." "No." His smile had widened. "I think you should fix it properly. On your knees." The table had erupted in laughter. Susan's face had burned, but she'd started to kneel, not on the floor, just to crouch beside the table, to accommodate the command while preserving some fragment of dignity. That's when his foot had found the back of her knee. Not a nudge. A shove. She'd gone down hard, tray flying, glasses exploding like fireworks across the amber-lit floor. And the room, the entire room full of witnesses and wealth and supposed sophistication, had done absolutely nothing. Now, kneeling in the wreckage of that moment, Susan felt something shift in the air, a pressure change, like the atmosphere before a storm. She looked up through the curtain of her curls and saw him. Felix. Her brother stood 20 feet away, dark coat hanging open, hands relaxed at his sides, face absolutely calm. But Susan knew that calm, had grown up learning to read the stillness that came before Felix delivered consequences. Their eyes met. She saw recognition flicker across his expression, not surprise, not shock, but something colder. Confirmation. The kind of look that said he'd always known something like this might happen, had always been prepared for exactly this moment. Susan wanted to stand, wanted to run to him, wanted to tell him she was fine. It was fine. Nothing she couldn't handle. But her knees were embedded with glass, and her uniform was ruined, and tears were still wet on her cheeks, and fine felt like a lie her body couldn't support. Felix took another step forward. Silent, measured. The three men still hadn't noticed him. They were too busy enjoying their performance, too drunk on their own perceived dominance. "I think she needs to apologize," Derek was saying, phone still pointed downward, recording Susan's humiliation for whatever audience he imagined would appreciate it. A real apology. On her knees, where she belongs. His friends laughed harder. Around the room, patrons shifted uncomfortably. The woman in pearls looked away. The man in the gray suit studied his steak with sudden intensity. Miguel, the bartender, gripped the bar so hard his hands shook, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. The Velvet Crown had rules, after all. Unspoken but absolute. Rule number 1, don't interfere with customers. Rule number 2, witnesses stay silent. Rule number 3, some people matter more than others. Felix crossed another 5 feet. Close enough now that the bartender could see him clearly. Miguel's eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly, though no sound came out. Other staff members noticed next. A server near the kitchen door went pale. A busboy froze mid-step. The recognition spread through the room like electricity through water, invisible but undeniable. Power recognized power. Authority bent toward greater authority. The three men remained oblivious. Derek nudged another piece of glass toward Susan with his shoe. "Come on, clean up your mess. Show us you take your job seriously." Susan reached for the glass with trembling fingers. Felix stopped directly behind them and waited, patient, letting the moment breathe, letting every witness understand what they were about to see, because justice meant nothing if it wasn't remembered. The Velvet Crown had seen Felix Montero before, though never like this, never with murder written in the stillness of his shoulders. He stood 5 feet behind the three men, close enough to hear Derek's laughter, close enough to see the angle of the phone pointed at his sister, close enough to count the pieces of glass cutting into Susan's knees. His hands remained loose at his sides, fingers relaxed, breathing steady. But anyone who'd survived long enough in his world knew. Felix was most dangerous when he looked most calm. Around the room, recognition spread like a contagion. Miguel, the bartender, set down the glass he'd been holding with exaggerated care, as if any sound might detonate something already armed and counting down. His coworker, a younger guy who'd started last month, leaned in and whispered, "Who is that?" Miguel's response came through clenched teeth. "Don't look at him." But everyone was looking. Impossible not to. 2 servers near the kitchen had stopped mid-stride, trays balanced on their palms, food growing cold. A busboy pressed himself against the wall, suddenly desperate to be invisible. The hostess stand had been abandoned entirely. The young woman who usually manned it had retreated to the back office, phone in hand, already making calls to people who needed to know Felix Montero was in the building. The woman in pearls whispered urgently to her dinner companion. a silver-haired man whose face had gone the color of old paper. He dropped a $50 bill on the table, didn't wait for change, didn't ask for a check, and stood with the careful movements of someone trying not to attract predator attention. They weren't the only ones preparing to leave. At a corner booth, 3 businessmen in tailored suits suddenly remembered urgent appointments. Near the bar, a couple signaled frantically for their tab. By the windows, an older gentleman who'd been nursing the same scotch for an hour pushed it away untouched and headed for the exit with remarkable speed for someone his age. The Velvet Crown was bleeding patrons, but the 60 who remained stayed frozen, caught between self-preservation and morbid fascination. Because this whatever was about to happen would become the story they told for years, the night they witnessed Felix Montero deliver a lesson at the Velvet Crown. Felix's reputation preceded him the way thunder precedes lightning. You heard it first, felt it in your chest, knew the strike was coming. They said he'd built his influence on 2 principles, family and memory. Family meant protection without negotiation. You touched someone under his care. You answered to him personally. Memory meant witnesses. Felix didn't hide consequences. He displayed them. Made sure people remembered what happened when you crossed certain lines. They said he'd once walked into a restaurant where a business partner had been disrespected and calmly asked the owner to close for the evening. When the owner refused, Felix had actually smiled, and made a phone call. 20 minutes later, the city health inspector arrived. 30 minutes after that, the building inspector. By morning, the restaurant had 3 violations, 2 lawsuits, and a landlord suddenly interested in renegotiating the lease. The owner never learned who'd made those calls. He didn't need to. They said Felix didn't raise his voice because he'd never needed to. Authority that requires volume isn't really authority at all. They said a lot of things about Felix Montero. Some were exaggerated. Some were myths built on fragments of truth. But the core of every story was accurate. Felix protected what was his with the kind of totality that made examples of people who forgot that fact. And Susan kneeling on broken glass, tears wet on her cheeks, dignity shattered across polished wood, Susan was his. Felix observed the scene with the detached precision of someone cataloging evidence. The position of Susan's body, the angle of Derek's phone, the scattered glass, the spreading liquor, the expressions on surrounding faces, shock, fear, shameful relief. It wasn't them on the floor. He noted everything, filed it away, evidence for the trial that had already concluded. Derek was still talking, oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure. You know what your problem is? You don't know your place. Someone needs to teach you. Felix moved. Not rushed, not aggressive. Just shifted his weight forward, took 2 steps, and the air itself seemed to contract. The busboy against the wall actually gasped. Derek's friend, the stocky one with rings on every finger, felt it first. That primitive hindbrain warning that said predator, danger, run. He turned slowly, smile fading before his eyes even focused. When he saw Felix, the blood drained from his face so quickly he swayed. Derek, he said, voice barely audible. Derek, we need to. What? Derek didn't look up from Susan, too focused on his performance. I'm not done teaching. Derek, sharper now, urgent. The third man, lean and cruel, smiled, had gone absolutely still. Phone lowered, eyes locked on Felix with the kind of recognition that came from survival instinct. He'd seen enough dangerous men to know he was looking at something several tiers above his weight class. Derek finally registered his friend's reactions, finally turned around, finally saw. Felix stood 3 feet away now, hands still relaxed, coat hanging open, face carved from the kind of discipline that required no performance. He didn't need to puff his chest or flex his shoulders or widen his stance. Didn't need to announce himself. Power that has to announce itself isn't power. It's theater. This was power. Derek's phone slipped in his suddenly sweaty grip. His smile, that cruel, entitled smile, crumbled like cheap plaster under pressure. Recognition hit him in stages. First the face, then the name, then the implications of both. Oh, he said softly. Then again quieter. Oh. Felix said nothing, didn't blink, just stared at Derek with eyes that calculated exactly how much pain this lesson would cost, exactly how permanent the memory would be, exactly how thoroughly Derek would regret the next 5 minutes for the rest of his considerably less comfortable life. Behind him, Susan had gone completely still. Glass still embedded in her knees, tears still wet on her face. But something had shifted in her posture. The crushing weight of helplessness had lifted, replaced by something else. Hope. Felix's jaw tightened fractionally. the only visible sign of the rage burning beneath that cold, controlled exterior. Then he spoke. 2 words, quiet enough that only the men immediately around him could hear, but those 2 words changed everything. Step away. 2. Felix's voice was quiet, almost polite, the kind of tone you'd use asking someone to pass the salt at dinner. But it carried the weight of absolute authority, the certainty of consequence, the promise that this was the only warning they'd receive. Derek stumbled backward so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. His phone clattered to the floor, screen cracking against the wood. The stocky one with the rings moved sideways, putting distance between himself and Susan like she'd suddenly become radioactive. The lean one, the cruel-smiled one, raised his hands slowly, palms out. Universal language for, "I'm not a threat." 3 seconds. That's how long it took for their entire power structure to collapse. Felix didn't move closer. Didn't need to. He just stood there, coat hanging open, hands relaxed, watching them scramble away from his sister with the clinical interest of someone observing a predictable chemical reaction. Around the room, 60 witnesses held their collective breath. Susan remained on the floor, glass still cutting into her knees, but her hands had stopped trembling. She stared up at her brother, tears drying on her cheeks, and something passed between them, years of history compressed into a single look. All the times he'd protected her as kids. All the reasons she'd stopped asking for help as an adult. All the distance she'd put between them to prove she could survive on her own. And here he was anyway, like he'd always been watching, like he'd always known this moment might come. Felix's gaze shifted from the men to Susan, and his expression softened fractionally, not much, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know him. But Susan saw it, saw the concern beneath the controlled rage, the fear beneath the authority. "You're hurt," he said quietly. Not a question, a statement of fact that someone would answer for. Susan started to shake her head, started to say she was fine, but Felix was already moving. He stepped past the 3 men like they were furniture irrelevant, beneath notice, and knelt beside his sister with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. Up close, Felix was even more imposing. Broad shoulders, muscled forearms visible where his sleeves were rolled, chest broad beneath his pressed shirt. But it was his face that held attention, sharp jawline, dark eyes that missed nothing, features that could have been handsome in a softer life but had been hardened by choices and consequences. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and gently pushed Susan's curls back from her face. His fingers were careful, tender, the same hands that had built a reputation for delivering pain now wiping tears from his sister's cheeks with a gentleness that made the watching crowd ache. "Let me see," Felix said. Susan shifted slightly, and he saw the glass embedded in her knees, the blood seeping through her stockings, the way she'd been kneeling in liquid and shards for God knew how long, while 3 men laughed and a room full of people watched. Something flickered across Felix's face. Not rage was too hot, too immediate. This was colder, deeper, the kind of anger that didn't explode but rather calcified into permanent consequence. He looked up at Miguel behind the bar, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "First aid kit. Now." Miguel moved faster than he'd ever moved in his life, nearly knocking over 2 bottles in his haste to reach the kit beneath the register. He brought it to Felix personally, hands shaking slightly as he offered it. "Thank you," Felix said, polite as Sunday dinner. Miguel retreated quickly. Felix opened the kit with practiced efficiency and pulled out antiseptic wipes, gauze, tweezers. He set them on the floor beside him in a neat line, then looked at Susan with an expression that asked permission without words. She nodded. He began removing glass from her knees with the precision of someone who'd done field medicine before. Each piece came out clean, dropped into his palm, transferred to a napkin Miguel had nervously provided. Felix worked in silence, focused entirely on his sister, the rest of the room temporarily forgotten. This was the image that would burn into every witness's memory. Felix Montero, one of the city's most feared figures, kneeling on the floor of the Velvet Crown, carefully tending his sister's wounds with hands that could break bones but chose instead to heal. The woman in pearls had tears in her eyes. The man in the gray suit looked like he might be sick. Even the staff seemed shaken by the intimacy of it, the contrast between reputation and reality. Behind them, Derek and his friends remained frozen, shoes scraping occasionally against wood as they shifted weight, unsure if they were allowed to leave, terrified to stay. Felix cleaned Susan's knees with antiseptic, then wrapped them carefully in gauze. He worked without speaking, jaw tight, shoulders tense. When he finished, he helped her stand one hand under her elbow, the other supporting her back, and steadied her until he was certain she could hold her own weight. Only then did he turn around. The temperature in the room plummeted. Felix's expression had shifted from gentle concern to something carved from ice and inevitability. He looked at the three men the way you might look at a stain that needed removing, a problem that required solving, an error that demanded correction. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Look, we didn't know." Felix raised one hand. Palm out. "Stop." Derek's mouth snapped shut so fast his teeth clicked. "You don't apologize to me," Felix said quietly. Each word precisely articulated, carefully spaced. "You don't explain to me. You don't speak to me at all." He took one step forward. The three men collectively stepped back. "You humiliated my sister," Felix continued, voice still quiet, still controlled. "Made her kneel on broken glass. Recorded it, laughed about it. In front of 60 witnesses. Another step forward, another step back from them. So here's what happens next," Felix said. "You're going to leave. You're going to walk out of here with whatever dignity you think you have left. And you're going to spend the rest of your lives remembering this moment." Derek's face had gone from pale to gray. "We're sorry, we didn't mean—" "I said," Felix interrupted, voice dropping even lower. "You don't speak to me." He turned slightly, addressing the room now, making sure every witness heard clearly. "These three men," he gestured without looking at them, "are no longer welcome in the Velvet Crown. Not tonight, not ever. Anyone who serves them, anyone who accommodates them, anyone who pretends they're acceptable company, you answer to me personally." Silence. Felix looked at the manager, who'd appeared from his office looking like he might faint. "Am I understood?" The manager nodded so hard his glasses slipped down his nose. "Yes, sir. Completely understood." "Good." Felix turned back to the three men. "Leave. Now." They ran. Not literally, pride wouldn't allow them to sprint through the Velvet Crown like frightened children, but their exit carried the unmistakable energy of flight. Derek's shoulder hit the doorframe on his way out. The stocky one with the rings forgot his coat draped over the chair. The lean one looked back once, caught Felix's eyes still tracking him, and moved faster. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the Velvet Crown moved. 60 witnesses frozen in a tableau of aftermath, afraid that breathing too loudly might remind Felix Montero they'd watched his sister kneel on broken glass and done nothing to stop it. Then Felix turned back to Susan. The transformation was immediate. The ice melted from his expression, replaced by concern so raw it felt intrusive to witness. He reached for her again, this time checking the gauze on her knees, making sure the wrapping was secure, that no glass remained embedded in her skin. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly. Susan shook her head, though they both knew she was lying. Felix didn't call her on it. Instead, he shrugged out of his dark coat, expensive fabric, perfectly tailored, and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her smaller frame, hung past her hips. But it was warm and it smelled like safety, and Susan pulled it tighter around herself without thinking. "Thank you," she whispered. Felix's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to thank me for this. I know. But I am anyway." He studied her face, really looked at her for the first time since arriving. Saw the exhaustion beneath the tears. The weight of months spent enduring what she thought she had to endure. The strength it took to kneel on broken glass without screaming. "You're stronger than you think," Felix said. "I don't feel strong." Strength isn't feeling strong. It's surviving when you don't feel strong at all. He glanced around the room, at the witnesses still frozen in their seats. "You survived this, in front of all these people who should have helped and didn't." Shame rippled through the crowd like a wave. The woman in pearls looked down at her plate. The man in the gray suit studied his hands. Near the bar, a younger couple who'd been filming on their phones now tucked them away guiltily, suddenly aware of their own complicity. Felix let the silence stretch, let the discomfort build. This was part of the lesson too, not just for the 3 men who'd fled, but for everyone who'd chosen witnessing over intervention. Then he did something no one expected. He knelt again. Not to tend wounds this time, but to collect the pieces of broken glass scattered across the floor. One by one, carefully, he picked up each shard and placed them in the napkin Miguel had provided earlier. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, the most dangerous man in the room cleaning up the mess other men had made. Susan watched him, throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. "Felix, you don't have to." "Yes," he interrupted gently. "I do." Miguel appeared beside them, first aid kit still in hand, looking uncertain. "Sir, I can—" "No." Felix didn't look up. This is mine to clean. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. Felix Montero, who had people to clean his messes, who could make a phone call and have the entire lounge scrubbed by morning, was on his knees in a public space, tending to the aftermath of his sister's humiliation personally. It was the most powerful thing he could have done. More powerful than violence. More memorable than threats. This image, Felix kneeling beside Susan, carefully collecting glass, treating the moment with a reverence that said family matters more than pride would outlive any beating he could have delivered. When he finished, Felix stood and held out his hand to Susan. Not pulling, not demanding, offering. She took it. He helped her stand fully upright, and this time when she swayed slightly, Felix steadied her with a hand on her elbow, patient and present, letting her find her balance at her own pace. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so. Then let's get you out of here." But before they could move toward the exit, the floor manager appeared, the same man who'd recited rules on Susan's first day, who'd taught her that customers were always right even when they were wrong. He looked pale, sweat beading on his forehead, hands clasped in front of him like a supplicant approaching a throne. "Mr. Montero," he began, voice trembling, "I want to apologize for what happened here tonight. This establishment has always prided itself on—" Felix turned to face him fully, and the manager's words died in his throat. "You pride yourself on what exactly?" Felix asked, tone conversational. "On letting your staff get humiliated? On teaching them that survival means swallowing abuse? On creating an environment where men like that feel comfortable making a woman kneel?" The manager opened his mouth, closed it. No answer would save him. "My sister," Felix continued, "has worked here for 3 months. 3 months of showing up on time, doing her job well, enduring things she shouldn't have had to endure. And tonight, when she needed one person, just one person to step in, your establishment failed her completely. We have policies about customer conflicts." "Policies?" Felix repeated, the word somehow damning. "Those 3 men assaulted her, made her bleed, filmed it for entertainment. And your policies said to do nothing?" The manager's face went from pale to gray. We didn't want to escalate." "You already escalated. By doing nothing." Felix's voice remained quiet, controlled, which made it more terrifying than shouting ever could have been. "You escalated her pain, her humiliation, her belief that she had to survive this alone." Felix glanced around the room, making sure every witness heard his next words clearly. "Effective immediately, Susan no longer works here. She quits. With full pay for tonight and compensation for 3 months of hostile work environment." The manager looked like he might argue, then caught the expression on Felix's face and thought better of it. "Of course. Whatever you think is—" "I don't think. I know." Felix turned back to Susan, expression softening again. "Ready?" Susan nodded, tears threatening again, but for different reasons now. Relief, gratitude, the overwhelming feeling of being protected after months of protecting herself. Felix guided her toward the exit, coat still draped over her shoulders, his hand steady at her back. Behind them, the velvet crown remained frozen 60 witnesses who would never forget the night they learned what real power looked like. It wasn't cruelty. It was gentleness that chose violence only when necessary, and family that came when you needed it most. They almost made it to the door. Felix's hand remained steady at Susan's back, guiding her past empty tables and averted eyes. Past the bar where Miguel still gripped the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Past the hostess stand that remained abandoned. 10 more feet, and they would have been outside. 10 more feet, and the night would have ended with quiet consequence. 3 men exiled, 1 sister protected, 60 witnesses left to wrestle with their own complicity. But Derek made the second mistake. He was waiting outside, phone pressed to his ear, pacing near the marble steps. When he saw Felix and Susan emerge from the entrance, he lowered the phone slightly. His face had regained some color, some misplaced confidence that came from distance and the illusion of safety. "Calling my lawyer right now," he was saying loud enough to be heard. "That psycho can't just ban us from—" He stopped mid-sentence when Felix turned to look at him. Susan felt her brother's hand tighten fractionally against her back, the only outward sign of the rage that must have been coursing through him. But his expression remained calm, almost serene. That's when she knew Derek had just made a fatal error in judgment. "Susan," Felix said quietly, not taking his eyes off Derek. "Wait by the car, Felix. Please." His tone was gentle but immovable. "Give me 2 minutes." Susan hesitated, then nodded. Felix's driver, a mountain of a man named Victor, had already appeared with the car, a sleek black sedan that whispered money and consequences. Victor opened the back door for Susan, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes tracking Derek with the focused attention of someone calculating threat levels. Susan slid into the leather interior, coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and watched through the tinted window as Felix descended the marble steps with that same unhurried deliberateness that had carried him across the velvet crown floor. Derek's two friends had vanished. Smart. They'd recognized the danger and disappeared into whatever holes men like them crawled into when consequences came calling. But Derek remained, phone still in hand, false bravado propped up by whatever voice was on the other end of that call. "I'm going to sue you," Derek said as Felix approached. Harassment, intimidation, threatening behavior. Felix stopped 3 feet away. "Are you finished? You can't just—" "I asked if you were finished." Something in Felix's tone, that absolute, unshakable authority, made Derek's mouth snap shut. He lowered his phone completely, though his hand still gripped it like a talisman. "Good," Felix said. "Now listen carefully, because I'm only going to explain this once." Inside the car, Susan watched her brother's back, saw the set of his shoulders, the controlled stillness that preceded action. She'd seen this before, years ago, when a teacher had humiliated her in front of her entire class. Felix had been 17 then, already building the reputation that would define his adult life. He'd shown up at the school the next day and had a conversation with that teacher, just a conversation. Nothing physical, nothing actionable, but the teacher had transferred to a different district within the month. Felix didn't need violence. He had something far more effective: the certainty of consequence. "You put your hands on my sister," Felix continued, voice carrying in the quiet night air. "You made her kneel. You filmed her crying. You turned her pain into entertainment." Derek opened his mouth to interrupt, but Felix raised one finger and the words died unspoken. "I let you walk out of there intact. I gave you the opportunity to leave with your dignity, whatever scraps of it remained. But standing out here, calling your lawyer, threatening me, that tells me you didn't learn anything. I have rights." "You had rights," Felix corrected. "Past tense. You forfeited them when you decided humiliating people was acceptable recreation." Derek's face flushed. "You're threatening me. I have witnesses." "No." Felix's smile was terrible in its gentleness. "I'm not threatening you. I'm explaining reality. There's a difference." He took one step closer. Derek flinched but held his ground, phone still clutched in his hand. "Here's what's going to happen," Felix said. "You're going to hang up that phone. You're not calling a lawyer. You're not filing a complaint. You're not posting on social media about tonight. You're not doing anything except going home and thinking very carefully about the choices that led you here. And if I don't?" Derek's voice tried for defiance but landed somewhere closer to desperation. Felix tilted his head slightly, considering. "You really want to know?" The question hung in the night air between them. Derek's hand trembled slightly, phone wavering. "I know people," Derek said, trying for confidence. "Important people. You can't just—" "Important people," Felix repeated, and now there was genuine amusement in his tone. "Tell me, Derek, do any of these important people owe you more than they fear me?" Derek's face went pale again. "That's what I thought." Felix reached out slowly. Derek flinched again but didn't move and plucked the phone from Derek's trembling hand. He glanced at the screen, saw the call was still connected. "Is this your lawyer?" Derek nodded mutely. Felix raised the phone to his ear, his voice returning to that polite, conversational tone. "Good evening. My name is Felix Montero. Your client just assaulted my sister in a public establishment. He's currently considering filing a harassment complaint against me for intervening. I wanted to give you an opportunity to provide him with proper legal counsel before he makes his situation considerably worse." A pause. Felix listened, expression neutral. "Yes, that Felix Montero." Another pause. "I appreciate your professionalism. Have a good evening." He ended the call and handed the phone back to Derek, who took it with a hand that now shook visibly. "Your lawyer suggests," Felix said pleasantly, "that you go home, delete any footage from tonight, and forget this evening ever happened. He also suggests you find new counsel if you plan to pursue this further, as his firm doesn't take cases they can't win." Derek stared at the phone like it had betrayed him. "Now," Felix continued, "you have 2 choices. Walk away right now and live with what you did. Or keep talking, keep threatening, keep pretending you have leverage you don't possess, and discover exactly how much worse I can make your life without ever touching you again." He stepped back, giving Derek space to leave. "Choose wisely. You won't get a third chance." Derek looked at Felix, then at the car where Susan watched, then back at Felix. Whatever he saw in those calm, calculating eyes made the decision for him. He turned and walked away quickly, shoulders hunched, phone dark in his hand. Felix watched until Derek disappeared around the corner, then turned and walked back to the car with that same measured pace. Victor opened the door for him, and he slid into the back seat beside Susan. The car pulled away from the Velvet Crown in silence. Victor drove with the quiet competence of someone who'd seen worse nights than this, his eyes checking the rearview mirror at regular intervals, always watching, always assessing. Susan sat wrapped in Felix's coat, forehead pressed against the cool window, watching the city lights blur past. Her knees throbbed beneath the gauze, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional exhaustion settling over her like heavy fabric. Felix said nothing, just sat beside her, hands folded in his lap, giving her space to process. 3 blocks passed before Susan spoke. "You didn't hurt him." "No. Why not?" Felix turned to look at her, expression unreadable in the shifting light. "Because some punishments last longer than bruises." Susan absorbed this, then nodded slowly. She understood. She'd grown up watching Felix operate, watching him build influence not through violence but through the carefully orchestrated collapse of consequences. Their father had been the opposite, all rage and fists and immediate gratification. Felix had learned young that fear based on anticipation was more effective than fear based on memory. "What happens to them now?" she asked quietly. Felix pulled out his phone, a sleek device that looked ordinary but Susan knew was anything but. He tapped the screen a few times, then began making calls. The first was to someone named Marcus. "It's me," Felix said when the call connected. "I need you to look into 3 men." He rattled off names: Derek Castellano, James Voss, Peter Chen, along with physical descriptions and the fact they'd been at the Velvet Crown tonight. Employment, business licenses, professional associations, anything that gives them standing. "I want to know where they're vulnerable." A pause while he listened. "No, nothing illegal. I just want information. By morning." He ended the call and immediately dialed another number. This time a woman answered. Susan could hear her voice through the speaker, professional and alert, despite the late hour. "Elena, I need a favor. 3 men assaulted someone under my protection tonight at the Velvet Crown. I want it known they're no longer welcome in any establishment where I have influence." Elena's response was immediate. "The usual list?" "Expanded list. Every restaurant, club, lounge, and bar in the city that values my patronage. They get turned away at the door. Politely, professionally, but absolutely. Consider it done. Do you want this permanent or temporary?" Felix glanced at Susan, then back at his phone. "Permanent until I say otherwise." "Understood. I'll have it circulated within the hour." The call ended. Felix made 3 more in rapid succession to people whose names Susan didn't recognize but whose tones suggested they took Felix's requests very seriously. Each conversation was brief, professional, devastating in its efficiency. By the time the 4th call ended, Derek, James, and Peter had been effectively exiled from the city's social infrastructure, not through violence, not through overt threat, just through the quiet withdrawal of access and influence that made a city navigable for men like them. Susan watched her brother work with a mixture of awe and discomfort. This was Felix's world, a world where power moved through phone calls and favors, where consequences accumulated silently until they became inescapable. "You're scaring me a little," she admitted. Felix lowered his phone and looked at her directly. "Good. Not because I want you afraid of me, but because I want you to understand you're never as alone as you feel. I didn't ask for this." "I know. You never ask. That's the problem." He shifted in his seat to face her more fully. "Susan, you've been working at that place for 3 months. 3 months of coming home exhausted, of dodging my calls, of pretending everything was fine when I could hear in your voice that it wasn't. I was handling it. You were enduring it. There's a difference." Felix's jaw tightened. "And tonight it escalated from endurance to assault. So yes, I'm making calls. Yes, I'm using my influence. Because that's what family does." Susan felt tears threatening again. Frustration, gratitude, exhaustion all mixing together. "I wanted to prove I could survive without you." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Susan looked out the window, searching for words. "Because everyone in my life knows I'm Felix Montero's sister. At the community college, in job interviews, at the Velvet Crown, it's always there. This weight, this expectation, I wanted something that was mine, something I earned without your shadow making it easier." Felix was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it all night. I understand that. I do. But Susan, refusing help when you need it isn't strength. It's just pain you're choosing to carry alone. I didn't want to be weak. You think asking for help is weak? Felix reached over and gently tilted her chin so she had to look at him. You knelt on broken glass and didn't scream. You held yourself together while men tried to break you for entertainment. You survived months of subtle cruelty without letting it destroy your capacity for kindness. That's not weakness. That's the opposite of weakness. Tears spilled over despite Susan's best efforts. Felix pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of her injured knees, and let her cry against his shoulder while the car navigated the quiet streets. I'm sorry I didn't call you, Susan whispered. I'm sorry you felt you couldn't. They stayed like that for several blocks, brother and sister, protector and protected, both carrying the weight of choices and consequences. Eventually Susan pulled back, wiping her eyes. What happens now? Now? Felix pulled out his phone again and showed her the screen. Now Marcus sends me a very detailed report about 3 men who are about to have several very bad weeks. The report was already coming through employment information, business partnerships, professional certifications, social connections. Felix scrolled through it with the focused attention of someone reading evidence in a trial that had already been decided. Derek Castellano works in commercial real estate, Felix read aloud. His firm relies heavily on city contracts and connections with property developers, several of whom owe me favors. He scrolled further. James Voss owns a luxury car dealership, financing through 3 banks where I have significant accounts. Another scroll. Peter Chen is a financial consultant, manages portfolios for high-net-worth clients who value discretion and stability. Felix looked up at Susan. By tomorrow morning, Derek's firm will be reassessing his position. James's financing will become more expensive. Peter's clients will start asking uncomfortable questions about liability and judgment. You're going to ruin them. No, Felix corrected gently. I'm going to let them ruin themselves. I'm just removing the safety nets they didn't appreciate having. He powered off his phone and pocketed it. Consequences walk quietly, Susan. They don't announce themselves. They just arrive. The car turned onto a quieter street, away from the glittering downtown core where the Velvet Crown lived among other temples of manufactured sophistication. Here, the buildings were older, more honest brick facades that didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Victor pulled up to a brownstone with warm light glowing in the upper windows. Felix's place. Susan had been here before, though not recently. Not since she'd decided independence meant distance. Come inside, Felix said. It wasn't a command, despite how it might have sounded. Let me clean those wounds properly. Make sure there's no glass I missed. Susan wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could go home, take care of herself, continue the pattern of self-reliance she'd been building. But her knees hurt and exhaustion had settled into her bones, and the thought of being alone right now felt unbearable. Okay, she said quietly. Victor opened the door for them. Felix helped Susan out carefully, his hand steady under her elbow as she found her balance on the sidewalk. The gauze around her knees had darkened slightly, not bleeding through, but enough to show the wounds weren't superficial. Inside, the brownstone was exactly as Susan remembered. Clean lines, expensive but understated furniture, everything in its place. This was Felix's sanctuary, the space where he could shed the weight of reputation and just exist. He guided her to the couch, then disappeared into what she knew was a fully stocked medical supply closet. Felix had always been prepared for emergencies, a habit born from their childhood, from years of patching each other up after their father's rages. When he returned, he carried a proper first aid kit, bottled water, and clean towels. He knelt in front of her the second time tonight he'd taken that position and carefully began unwrapping the gauze he'd applied at the Velvet Crown. This might sting, he warned before applying fresh antiseptic. It did sting, but Susan bit her lip and stayed still. Felix worked with the same careful precision he'd shown before, checking for any remaining glass, cleaning the cuts thoroughly, applying antibiotic ointment before rewrapping with clean gauze. You've gotten better at this, Susan observed. Practice, Felix said without elaborating. They both knew what that meant. Felix's world required frequent medical attention that couldn't always involve hospitals and questions. When he finished, Felix sat back on his heels and studied his sister's face. When did we stop talking? The question caught Susan off guard. We still talk? No. We exchange information. Weather, work, surface-level updates. But we stopped talking. Really talking. The way we used to. Susan looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together. After you took over Dad's business. After you became, she gestured vaguely. This, Felix repeated. You mean after I became someone who scared you? Not scared. Never scared of you. Susan met his eyes. Scared for you. And scared of what being your sister meant. Everyone looked at me differently once your reputation grew. Like I was dangerous by association. Like I came with threats attached. Felix stood slowly and moved to sit beside her on the couch, careful not to jostle her injured legs. I never wanted that for you. I know. But it happened anyway. Susan pulled his coat tighter around herself. Do you remember when we were kids? Before everything got bad with Dad? I remember. You used to walk me to school every morning. Carried my backpack even though yours was heavier. Made sure I ate breakfast even when there wasn't much food in the house. Felix's jaw tightened at the memories. Someone had to. You were 12, Felix. 12 years old and already playing parent because ours couldn't. Susan's voice cracked slightly. And then you got older, and Dad got worse, and you had to make choices no teenager should make. Had to become hard to survive. I did what I had to do. I know, and I'm grateful. But Felix, you sacrificed your softness to keep us safe. And somewhere along the way, I think you forgot you were allowed to be anything other than dangerous. Felix was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands, the same hands that had just tenderly cleaned her wounds, the same hands that had built an empire on controlled violence and strategic fear. I didn't forget, he said finally. I just couldn't afford to be soft outside these walls. The world I operate in doesn't reward gentleness, but you were gentle tonight. At the Velvet Crown. You knelt beside me and cleaned glass off the floor and held me like I mattered more than your reputation. You do matter more than my reputation. You always have. Susan felt tears threatening again. She'd cried more tonight than she had in months. Then why does it feel like we're strangers pretending to be family? Felix turned to look at her fully, and for the first time all night, Susan saw past the controlled exterior to the hurt underneath. The loneliness of being powerful but isolated, the weight of being feared but not known. Because you pulled away? Felix said quietly. And I let you, because I thought that's what you needed. Distance from me, from what I am, from the consequences of being related to someone like me. I pulled away because I didn't want to be a liability. Didn't want you making choices based on protecting me instead of what was right for you. Susan, you're not a liability. You're the reason I make the choices I make. Everything I built, every move I've made, it's so you could have options I never had. Safety I never felt. Freedom to choose your own path. Even when my path led me to the Velvet Crown, to men who thought they could humiliate me because I was nobody, Felix's expression hardened. You were never nobody, not to me. And those men learned tonight what happens when people forget that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when everything falls apart. Susan leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, exhaustion finally winning over pride. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to stay away. I'm sorry I let you believe you had to survive alone. Felix wrapped his arm around her shoulders carefully. We're not good at this, are we? The talking thing. Terrible at it, Susan agreed, a small laugh escaping despite everything. They sat like that in the quiet brownstone, two people who'd survived the same childhood in different ways, finally remembering why they'd fought so hard to protect each other in the first place. Outside, the city continued its endless motion. But inside, for the first time in years, Felix and Susan simply existed together, not as protector and protected, not as dangerous reputation and vulnerable liability, but as what they'd always been underneath all of it. Brother and sister. Family. Morning light filtered through the brownstone's windows, gentle and forgiving in a way the previous night had not been. Susan woke on Felix's couch, a soft blanket draped over her that she didn't remember pulling up. Her brother sat in the chair across from her, already dressed, coffee in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. How long have you been awake? She asked, voice rough from sleep. A while. Old habits. Felix set down his coffee. How are your knees? Susan shifted slightly, testing. They hurt, but less than she'd expected. Manageable. Good. Because we need to talk about what happens next. Susan sat up carefully, blanket pooling around her waist. Next? The Velvet Crown doesn't get to pretend last night didn't happen. Neither do the people who watched. Felix leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I made some calls this morning. The ownership is very interested in demonstrating their commitment to staff safety. Felix, they're implementing new policies, mandatory intervention training for management, direct lines for reporting harassment, Security protocols for removing abusive patrons. He paused. And they're hosting a staff meeting today to address what happened and ensure it never happens again. Susan processed this. You're reforming the Velvet Crown. I'm making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else who works there. I don't work there anymore. You made me quit, remember? Felix's expression softened slightly. I gave you an exit. But if you want to go back, if you want to walk back into that room and show them you're not broken, I'll support that too. Your choice. The thought of returning to the Velvet Crown made Susan's stomach clench. But there was something appealing about the idea of walking back and standing upright. No longer the woman who'd knelt on broken glass while everyone watched. I want to see it, she said. I want to see if anything actually changes. Then we'll go together. The Velvet Crown looked different in daylight, less polished, more exposed. The amber lighting that had hidden so many cruelties couldn't compete with the sun streaming through those tinted windows. Staff had gathered in the main dining area, servers, bartenders, kitchen workers, all looking uncomfortable in the space they usually worked. Miguel stood near the bar, arms crossed, expression guarded. Other servers Susan recognized sat at tables, whispering to each other. When Felix and Susan walked in, silence dropped like a curtain. Every head turned. Every conversation died. They all remembered. Of course they remembered. The floor manager, the same man who'd recited rules about customer supremacy, stood near the hostess stand, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. Beside him stood a woman in an expensive suit that screamed corporate authority. The owner, Susan guessed, or someone close to ownership. Thank you all for coming, the woman began, voice steady despite the tension in the room. I'm Patricia Simmons, Regional Director. I'm here because last night, this establishment failed one of its employees in the most fundamental way possible. She gestured toward Susan. Many of you witnessed what happened. All of you heard about it by now. A server was assaulted by patrons while working her shift. She was physically harmed, publicly humiliated, and according to multiple accounts, 60 people watched it happen. The room shifted uncomfortably. Guilt was thick enough to taste. This isn't about blame, Patricia continued. This is about accountability and change. Effective immediately, the Velvet Crown is implementing new protocols. She outlined them systematically. Mandatory training, anonymous reporting systems, management empowered to remove abusive patrons without corporate approval, security staff trained to recognize escalating situations. But policies mean nothing without culture change, Patricia said. So I'm asking each of you, what would have made a difference last night? What needs to change so that next time, and there will be a next time someone gets out of line, we respond differently? Silence held for several seconds. Then Miguel spoke up. We need to know we won't get fired for defending each other. Agreed, Patricia said. Documented and guaranteed. A younger server raised her hand tentatively. Can we refuse to serve people who've been inappropriate before? Without getting in trouble? Yes. We're creating a database of banned patrons. If someone makes you uncomfortable, they don't get service. Period. Another voice. What about retaliation? People leave bad reviews, complain to management. We handle it, Patricia interrupted firmly. You protect each other, we protect you. That's the new standard. Felix had remained silent throughout, standing slightly behind Susan, present but not dominating. Now he stepped forward, just enough to be noticed. The Velvet Crown has always prided itself on discretion, he said, voice carrying easily. On being the kind of place where powerful people can relax. That doesn't change. But power without responsibility is just cruelty in expensive clothes. Your patrons need to understand, this is a place of respect now. For everyone in it. Patricia nodded. Mr. Montero is correct. We're notifying our regular clientele of the new expectations. Anyone unwilling to meet them can find somewhere else to spend their money. The staff exchanged glances, surprise, cautious hope, lingering skepticism. Change announced in a meeting was easy. Change sustained over weeks and months was harder. Susan stepped forward then, Felix's coat still draped over her shoulders like armor. I'm not coming back to work here, she said, voice steady despite her nerves. But I want you all to know something. Last night, I felt completely alone. I thought survival meant enduring whatever came my way silently. I was wrong. She looked around at the faces, watching her colleagues who'd frozen, management who'd failed, an entire ecosystem that had chosen comfort over intervention. You don't have to be alone, Susan continued. None of us do. What happened to me could happen to any of you. And when it does, when someone crosses a line, when you feel unsafe, When you need help, I hope you'll speak up. I hope you'll intervene for each other. Because nobody should have to kneel on broken glass while a room full of people watches. Miguel was the first to stand. Then another server, then another. Within seconds, the entire staff was on their feet, not applauding, not cheering, but standing in silent solidarity that said, "We hear you, we see you, we'll do better." Susan felt Felix's hand settle gently on her shoulder. Supportive, present, but letting her have this moment. The velvet crown would never be perfect. But maybe, just maybe, it could be better. The brownstone was quiet that evening. Felix had given Susan space to rest, to process, to decide what came next. She'd spent most of the afternoon on his couch, alternating between sleep and staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the past 24 hours on an endless loop. Now she stood in front of the mirror in Felix's guest bathroom, examining her reflection. The woman looking back at her had bandaged knees and exhaustion written in the shadows under her eyes, but she also looked different somehow. Stronger, maybe. Or just less willing to apologize for taking up space. A knock on the doorframe made her turn. Felix leaned against it, hands in his pockets, expression gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I don't know." Susan turned back to the mirror. "Part of me wants to pretend last night never happened, but a bigger part knows I can't unsee what I saw, which is how easy it is to become invisible, how quickly people choose comfort over courage." She met Felix's eyes in the reflection. How alone you can feel in a room full of witnesses. Felix stepped into the bathroom, leaning against the counter beside her. "You're not invisible, Susan. You never were." "I felt invisible. For 3 months, I felt like I only mattered when someone needed something from me. A drink refilled, a table cleared, an apology delivered for mistakes I didn't make." She touched the edge of the bandage on her knee. "And then last night, I mattered for all the wrong reasons. Because I was entertainment. Because hurting me was easier than respecting me. That's on them, not you. I know. But it still happened. And I can't pretend it didn't change something." Felix was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do now?" "Not what you think you should do. Not what makes the best story. What do you actually want?" Susan considered the question carefully. What did she want? "I want to stop proving things," she said finally. "I spent 3 months at the Velvet Crown trying to prove I could survive without you. Trying to prove I was strong enough, independent enough, capable enough. But all I proved was that suffering alone doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you alone. So what does that mean?" Susan turned to face her brother directly. "It means I'm done pretending I don't need people. Done treating help like weakness. Done carrying weight I don't have to carry just to prove some point about independence." Felix's expression shifted relief mixed with something that looked like pride. "That's the smartest thing I've heard you say in years. Don't let it go to your head." But Susan smiled slightly. "I'm still not moving back in with you, or joining the family business, or whatever protective big brother fantasy you've got planned. Wouldn't dream of it. But I'm also not going to disappear for months at a time because I'm afraid of being Felix Montero's sister. That's who I am, part of who I am. And last night taught me that connection isn't the same as weakness." Felix reached out and pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of her injuries. "I'm glad you're learning that. Took me longer than I'd like to admit." They stood like that for a moment, brother and sister, both carrying scars from childhoods that had required them to be harder than children should ever have to be. When they separated, Susan asked, "What happened to those 3 men, Derek and the others?" "They're learning what consequences feel like," Felix said simply. "Nothing illegal. Nothing you need to worry about. Just the natural result of choices they made. Will they come after me? Try to retaliate?" "No." Felix's voice carried absolute certainty. "Because they understand now what they didn't understand last night. You're not alone. You never were. You were just waiting for family to arrive." Susan felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you. For coming. For everything. You don't thank family for showing up. That's what we do." Later that evening, Susan stood at the brownstone's window, looking out at the city lights beginning to sparkle in the growing darkness. Felix sat in his chair, reading something on his phone, present but not hovering. This was different from the solitude she'd cultivated over the past year. That had been loneliness masquerading as independence. This was chosen proximity, being together because they wanted to be, not because they had to be. "Felix?" Susan said without turning around. "Yeah?" "The next job I get, the next place I work, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to speak up when something's wrong. I'm going to ask for help when I need it. I'm going to stop treating survival like a solo sport." "Good," Felix said. Because watching you suffer to prove a point was killing me. Susan turned to face him, leaning against the window frame. I wasn't trying to hurt you, I know. But Susan, you're not just my responsibility. You're my sister. Watching you struggle and not being allowed to help, that's its own kind of torture. I never said you weren't allowed. You didn't have to say it. You just stopped calling, stopped visiting, built walls between us and called it independence. Felix set down his phone. I respect your autonomy, but autonomy doesn't mean isolation. Susan absorbed this, recognizing the truth in it. I'll do better. We'll do better. Deal. The brownstone settled into comfortable silence. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, people going to work, coming home, making choices that would ripple through their lives in ways they couldn't predict. Somewhere out there, Derek and his friends were learning what it meant to lose access, to feel consequences accumulate like interest on unpaid debts. Somewhere out there, the Velvet Crown staff was deciding whether new policies meant real change or just better-worded exploitation. But here, in this moment, Susan stood in her brother's brownstone, injured but not broken, humiliated but not destroyed, learning that strength sometimes looked like admitting you needed help. She was Felix Montero's sister, and that wasn't a weakness, it was a fact. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.